5 minutes into the most important presentation of my career, my coworker leaned forward, smiled at the client, and said, "Sorry to interrupt, but that's not actually correct." I remember the exact second it happened because my hands went cold, not shaky. Cold. Like my body had already decided this was going to hurt. This wasn't a casual internal meeting. This was a live pitch to a client that represented almost a third of our department's annual revenue. If it landed, it put me on track for a promotion that had been dangling in front of me for a year. If it failed, I didn't just lose momentum. I lost credibility. Everyone in that room knew it. I had spent weeks preparing, late nights, dry runs, slides reviewed by legal, finance, and my manager. I knew the material forward and backward. I wasn't winging anything. And still, 5 minutes in, he cut me off. At first, I thought maybe I'd misspoken. That happens. So I paused, looked at my slide, then back at him. He didn't look confused. He looked comfortable, relaxed, like this was always the plan. He tapped his pen once against his notebook and added, "What he means to say is that the timeline is still flexible. We don't want to lock you into expectations we might not meet." That wasn't what I meant, and it wasn't true. The timeline wasn't flexible. It had been approved, signed off, and was one of the main reasons the client had agreed to this meeting in the first place. Changing that wasn't a clarification. It was a rewrite. I glanced at my manager. She didn't interrupt. She was watching the client. The client's lead, a woman who had been completely focused on my slides up until then, leaned back in her chair. She didn't say anything either. She just stopped taking notes. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't about helping me. It wasn't even about correcting me. It was about control. This coworker, I'll call him Mark, had been with the company longer than I had. Same level, different team. He had a reputation for being assertive, the kind of person leadership described as confident, and peers described as hard to work with. He talked a lot in meetings. He interrupted. He reframed other people's ideas as his own. Somehow, none of it ever stuck to him. When I was assigned as lead presenter for this account, he congratulated me in Slack, added a smiley face, offered to support however needed. I believed him. Now he was doing the opposite, and doing it in the cleanest, most deniable way possible. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult me. He just kept stepping in, gently, repeatedly, like he was saving the room from my incompetence. Every time I tried to continue, he'd add something, a small clarification, a quick note, a client-focused adjustment. Each one shaved a little more authority off me. By minute 8, I could feel the room shifting, not dramatically, subtly, the way people stop leaning forward, the way eyes move away from you and towards someone else. I adjusted. I slowed down. I stuck tighter to the slides. I chose my words carefully. He kept going. At one point, he laughed lightly and said, "Sorry, I don't want to overcorrect, but we should be careful with promises." That was the moment it clicked. He wasn't reacting to mistakes. He was manufacturing doubt. And he was doing it in front of the one audience that mattered. I felt the heat creep up my neck, the familiar urge to defend myself, to push back, to say, "That's not accurate." But I didn't. Not yet. Because as humiliating as it was, something else was happening at the same time. The client hadn't sided with him. They hadn't sided with me either. They were watching, and I didn't know it yet. But that was just the beginning. By the 10-minute mark, I understood something else too. Mark wasn't improvising. He was pacing himself. He waited until I'd finished a sentence, then slid in right after, like an echo that didn't quite match the original sound. Never aggressive, never loud, just confident enough to sound credible if you weren't paying close attention. When I moved on to the implementation slide, the one I knew cold, he leaned forward again. "Just to level set," he said, looking directly at the client, not at me. "There are still some internal dependencies we're working through." That was new. There were no unresolved dependencies. We'd closed them the previous week. I had the approval chain in my inbox, time-stamped and archived. He knew that. He'd been on the thread. I opened my mouth to correct him, then stopped, because the client's lead tilted her head slightly. Not confused, curious. And Mark missed it. He kept talking, explained risks that had already been mitigated, framed decisions as open-ended that had been finalized. It was subtle, but the picture he was painting wasn't just different from mine. It was safer, more cautious, less committal, less accountable. I could feel the familiar internal pressure building, the instinct to defend my work, to assert myself, to reclaim the narrative before it slipped away completely. That instinct had gotten me praised before. It had also gotten me labeled difficult once, in a performance review I hadn't fully recovered from. So I didn't interrupt him. Instead, I watched. I watched how he avoided specifics, how he spoke in generalities, how he redirected questions away from concrete answers and toward alignment, future conversations, and ongoing evaluation. And I watched the client stop asking follow-ups. That part scared me more than the interruption. Clients who are engaged push back. They probe. They clarify. Silence doesn't mean agreement. It means recalculation. My manager finally spoke up, not to stop him, to me. "Can you confirm that timeline again?" she asked. Neutral tone, eyes still on the client. This was the opening, the clean one, the safe one. I confirmed it, clearly, calmly. No edge, no defensiveness. I referenced the approval process, the dependencies already resolved, the safeguards we'd built in. I didn't look at Mark once. For half a second, the room stabilized. Then Mark smiled and said, "Right," assuming everything continued smoothly. There it was, the escape hatch. If things went well, he could say he supported it. If things went wrong, he'd warn them. I felt irritation give way to something colder, because now I understood his position. He wasn't trying to replace me in the room. He was trying to ensure himself against me. If I succeeded, he could align. If I failed, he could distance himself. And he was doing it live, in front of the people whose perception mattered most. The rest of the presentation blurred into a careful balancing act. I stuck to facts. I avoided speculation. I resisted every urge to correct his tone, his framing, his implications. He kept talking. I kept letting him. And something shifted. About 20 minutes in, the client asked a question. Not to Mark, but to me. It was specific, technical, about a constraint I'd mentioned earlier and how we planned to monitor it post-launch. Before I could answer, Mark started to jump in. The client held up a hand. "I'd like to hear his take on that," she said, just once. Calm. Polite. Mark leaned back. I answered, directly, with numbers, with process, with accountability. She nodded, took a note, asked one more follow-up, again to me. Mark didn't interrupt that time. I could feel his irritation even without looking at him, the slight shift in posture, the pen tapping again faster now. He wasn't losing the room, but he wasn't controlling it anymore. Still, I knew better than to relax, because people like Mark don't escalate loudly. They escalate later, in emails, in side conversations, in rewrites of history that happen when you're not in the room to hear them. And as the meeting wrapped up and the client thanked us for our time, I had a clear, sinking realization. The presentation wasn't the real battle. The aftermath would be. That was when I decided I wasn't going to play defense anymore. The moment the call ended, Mark didn't look at me. He closed his laptop first, too fast, like he was trying to end something before it could continue. Then he stood, gave my manager a quick nod, and said, "I'll follow up with some clarifications for the client." Already halfway to the door, that sentence stayed with me. Not a follow-up. Clarifications. I didn't say anything. I packed up slowly, thanked the client again, kept my tone professional. On the outside, everything looked fine. On the inside, something had snapped into focus. This wasn't about ego. It wasn't even personal. It was pattern behavior. Back at my desk, I pulled up the shared account folder. the one we all had access to. I wasn't looking for dirt, I was looking for structure. How information moved, who touched it, where influence actually lived when meetings ended. And that's when I noticed it. The last 3 client-facing recap emails hadn't come from the assigned account lead. They'd come from Mark, always framed as just summarizing, always sent late in the day, always copying leadership, clean language, no lies, just interpretation, emphasis, subtle reframing that positioned him as the stabilizing presence. I checked timestamps. He was fast, too fast, sending recaps before people had time to reflect, locking in a version of events while memory was still soft. I sat back and felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not panic. Clarity. That's how he survived. Not by being right, but by being first. I opened my sent folder, compared tone, compared wording. Mine were precise, conservative, sometimes too neutral. His were confident, directional, helpful. That was the difference. And suddenly the meeting made sense. The interruptions weren't random. They were set up. He was seeding the recap before it was ever written. That night, I didn't fire off a correction. I didn't slack my manager. I didn't warn anyone. Instead, I did something I hadn't done before. I documented. I pulled the approval emails, the finalized timelines, the dependency sign-offs. I organized them in a clean, readable sequence, not as ammunition, as context, something that could stand on its own if needed. Then I drafted my own follow-up email. I didn't send it, not yet, because the next morning, right on schedule, Mark's recap hit everyone's inbox. I read it carefully. He didn't contradict me outright. He softened everything, added qualifiers, used phrases like pending alignment and subject to further discussion. He positioned himself as the voice of caution, me as the enthusiastic executor. It was polished, plausible, and incomplete. He'd left out one thing. The client's question, the one she'd directed to me, the one moment where control had shifted. I smiled for the first time in 2 days. That omission told me everything I needed to know. Because people forget meetings, but they remember questions, especially the ones they chose who could answer. I waited exactly 40 minutes. Then I sent my email. Short, clean. No mention of Mark, no corrections, no defensiveness. I thanked the client for the specific questions they'd raised. Referenced the monitoring process we'd discussed. Attached the finalized timeline for convenience. Included the approval chain as a single PDF, clearly labeled. I CC'd the same people Mark had. Nothing confrontational, nothing emotional, just complete. 10 minutes later, my manager stopped by my desk. She didn't sit down. Good follow-up, she said quietly. Clear. That was all. An hour after that, the client replied. Not to the whole group. To me. She thanked me for the clarity. Asked if we could schedule a brief follow-up to walk through post-launch reporting in more detail. Suggested early next week. Added that she appreciated having someone who could speak concretely. She CC'd my manager. Mark wasn't included. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. This wasn't a win, not yet. But it was something else. It was confirmation. He hadn't underestimated me in the meeting. He'd underestimated what happens when you stop reacting and start letting people reveal themselves. The follow-up call was scheduled for Tuesday morning. Mark found out about it an hour later. Not from me, from the calendar. I saw the Slack notification pop up while I was reviewing notes. Hey, just saw a client sync added. Want me to join to help align? The wording was careful, casual, like he'd always been part of it. I didn't respond right away, because 10 minutes after that, my manager messaged me privately. Client asked for you specifically. Let's keep this one small. That was the first time she'd ever drawn a boundary like that, and she hadn't even mentioned Mark by name. By Monday afternoon, the pressure started building. Mark sent another message, this one longer. He framed it as concern, risk management. Just making sure we're presenting a unified front. He offered to still handle the recap afterward. to save me time. I replied with one sentence. I've got it covered, but appreciate the offer. Nothing more. The call itself was straightforward. No drama, no tension, just work. The client asked detailed questions. I answered them. I walked through the reporting structure, the escalation paths, the metrics we'd agreed on months earlier. I didn't oversell anything. I didn't hedge either. Halfway through, she said something that stuck. This is exactly what we were hoping to hear in the initial presentation. Not see. Hear. After we wrapped, she thanked me again and said she'd be sending formal feedback later that week. I knew what that meant. Client feedback at this level didn't just go into a file. It went into leadership meetings, quarterly reviews, account ownership discussions. By Wednesday, Mark was no longer subtle. He stopped by my desk unannounced, leaned against the partition like we were old friends. Hey, he said lightly, just wanted to make sure we're aligned on messaging. There's been some confusion. I looked up at him, calm, neutral. What confusion? He hesitated, just a fraction too long. Well, he said, smiling again, the client seems to be getting different impressions depending on who they talk to. That was the tell. He wasn't worried about confusion. He was worried about contrast. I'm sticking to what's approved, I said. Same as always. He nodded slowly. Right, of course. Then he straightened and added, almost as an afterthought, just make sure we're not overcommitting. I watched him walk away and felt something strange. Relief, because now he was doing it openly. Thursday morning, leadership scheduled a review, not labeled as disciplinary, just account alignment. Mark was invited. So was I. The client feedback had come in. The room was quiet as my manager read it aloud. Specific praise for clarity, for accountability, for consistency. A note about concerns when messaging felt diluted or redirected. No names mentioned. They didn't need to be. Mark spoke once, carefully. Said he supported the direction and was glad the client felt confident. No one challenged him. No one needed to. Because this time the record existed. Emails, attachments, timelines, feedback that matched one voice and quietly questioned the other. The meeting ended without fireworks, without confrontation. But when assignments were redistributed the following week, the account stayed with me. Mark was reassigned to focus on internal initiatives. He never said anything about it, neither did I. But as the office settled back into its routine, I realized something important. Chaos doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like systems finally doing what they're designed to do, once someone stops getting in their own way. And for the first time since that presentation, everything went quiet. By the time the dust settled, I realized something had changed. Not around me, but in me. No announcement was made. No one pulled me aside to say, "You handled that well." Corporate life doesn't work like that. Instead, things just aligned, quietly, intentionally. The account roadmap was updated with my name listed as primary contact. My manager looped me into conversations I hadn't been part of before. Budget forecasting, long-term expansion, risk planning. The kind of discussions you're only invited into when trust is already assumed. Mark kept his distance. He was still polite, still professional, still careful. But the casual interruptions stopped. The quick clarifications disappeared. He no longer spoke over me in meetings, or much at all when I was present. A few weeks later, I learned why. The client had requested a continuity clause. They wanted a single point of contact for the duration of the engagement. Someone who could speak decisively, document clearly, and follow through without reframing reality to sound safer than it was. Leadership agreed. It wasn't framed as a demotion. It never is. Mark was reassigned to internal process work, important supposedly, less visible, less client-facing. The kind of role where confidence matters less than compliance. He didn't fight it. People like him rarely do. Fighting requires a record, and records were the one thing he'd always tried to control. I saw him once in the break room after that. Same smile. Same tone. "Looks like things worked out," he said. "They did," I replied. And that was it. No victory lap, no closure speech. Just two professionals acknowledging reality. Later that evening, as I shut down my laptop, I thought back to that first interruption. 5 minutes into a presentation I'd been sure would define me. In a way, it had, not because I'd been humiliated, but because I'd learned something most people don't learn until much later. You don't win these moments by reacting faster or speaking louder. You win by understanding how systems actually work and letting them do the heavy lifting. I didn't expose him. I didn't confront him. I didn't need revenge. I just stopped covering for him. And when I did, the contrast became unavoidable. The client saw it. Leadership saw it. Eventually, he did too. There were no loose ends, no unanswered questions. Just a quiet recalibration, the kind that feels permanent. The presentation that almost broke me ended up doing something else entirely. It taught me that dignity isn't about defending yourself in the moment. Sometimes it's about staying steady long enough for the truth to speak without help. And when it finally does, it doesn't raise its voice. It just stands there, undeniable.